Happy New Year to all of you. So glad that you are here. Welcome to those of you who are joining us online. We're glad that you're with us as well. We also have lots of kids here today. We have the 2nd through 5th graders, so welcome all of you 2nd through 5th graders. We are glad that you are here as well. Okay, we can clap for the kids. We like kids around here. In 2012, Lionsgate Studios, film production studio, put out a movie called Girl in Progress. It's a story of a young girl named Anna who is growing up in a single-family home. A single-parent home. Her mom works 2 jobs to try and provide for her and her daughter. She's a good kid, really responsible, really studious, always doing things around the house to help out her mom. Her mom, though, is a bit of a mess. Her mom is working these 2 jobs, but anytime she's not at work, she's hanging out with whoever is the latest guy in her life. And you learn pretty quick in the movie that this young girl named Anna wants life to be different. She wants things to change for her, and she thinks the best way to have a change, meaning she wants a change in her family, she wants a mom who's present, she comes to the conclusion the best way to have this change in my life is to be out on my own, to go start my own life. So she's a, sophomore in high school, and in her English class, they're studying all different types of stories, different types of literature, but specifically different types of plot lines in stories. So like the quest, the journey, the transformation, the change, the overcoming the monster, the rags to riches story. And the one that catches her attention the most is the coming of age story. And they start to talk about in this class how usually different types of stories have different characteristics that mark them as these types of stories. And the coming of age story is typically a story of what it means for a young person to step into adulthood. And she's thinking to herself, that's the story that I want to live. And I want to live that now because I want my life to be different. And so they talk about all of these different character traits or characteristics of these coming-of-age stories and how people in these stories oftentimes redefine themselves. They often kind of push back or separate from the authority in their life. And sometimes in these stories, it leads to streaks of rebellious activity. Sometimes they have to go on a journey that tests their inner resolve, and there's all these rites of passage of coming into adulthood. And so what she does as she studies this, she goes home, and in her bedroom, she creates a story arc of all of these things that she wants to do to follow this story to essentially become an adult. But what she finds as she kind of redefines herself, gives herself a new look, separates from her old friends, tries to fit in with the cool, rebellious crowd, is that it doesn't lead her to a path of freedom. It actually frustrates her life and in some ways complicates her life. And there's a scene in the movie that captures it all. One of her mom's signature looks, as her mom has long brown hair, is she'll often put her hair up in a bun, but she'll use a pencil to hold it up. So Anna walks into this party. Her last rite of passage to become an adult is to go to this all-night party and try and hook up with a guy. And she goes to this party, and as she walks in, the first thing she does, just instinctively, is she puts her hair up in a bun, grabs a pencil from her purse, and sticks it in, and walks into the party. She's trying to make friends with everybody there. She finds this guy that she thinks cute, and she's trying to build a connection with him, but she keeps fumbling along the way. She keeps embarrassing herself, and all of the people at the party start to make fun of her, and at one point she hits her head, bumps her head, and she goes to grab her head, and she naturally grabs the pencil in her hair and pulls it out and looks at it, and she comes to realize, I've been following this path. I've been following this story, hoping that it would bring me freedom, but all I'm doing is becoming like my mom. It's a moment where the filmmakers show she's not changing her story, she's just reinforcing her mom's story in her life, which is the very thing she's trying to escape. And so naturally, when we come to this time of year, 2 questions start to surface for us. One, what sort of change do you want in your life? We often get reflective during this time of year about the year we just finished and the hopes and dreams we have for the year ahead. And oftentimes around this time of year, we're thinking about what are the things that I want to change? What are the things that I want different? If I could rewrite my story, how would I write it? I mean, is it that you want to be more present with your family and your kids and your spouse, and you think to yourself, what do I have to do to be more engaged in my family? But maybe it's your health. You're thinking like, hey, I'd love to lose a little bit of weight. I'd love to get out on a workout journey, a workout habit. I'd love to change my health and change the way I eat and extend my life, hopefully. Or maybe there's things about your faith, and you think to yourself, yeah, I want to get serious about my relationship with the Lord. I want to grow in what I know to be true of God. What are the things that you want to be different in your life as you move into and through 2026? That's one question. The second question, maybe we're not as aware of this question, but it always turns over in our head. The second question is, what is the story you look to bring about that change? What is the change you want in your life, and what story are you following to bring it about? Now, oftentimes, again, when we hit this time of year and we want to make a change, what do? We set a New Year's resolution. And basically, New Year's resolutions follow the story of determination and discipline. I mean, if I just work hard enough, if I'm just determined enough, if I just set a reminder and an alarm clock and I create a habit, I can be determined and disciplined to bring about this change. Oftentimes, that's the story of elite athletes, successful entrepreneurs, and world-class musicians. They're determined, they're disciplined, they just work, and they become that person. It's not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes it can be inspiring, but it can also sometimes be burdensome. Especially when you try and bring that mentality into your faith and you think that's what God wants for you to become this type of person. So you work. And then usually what happens by January 28th, you're exhausted. And then you think to yourself, well, maybe there's a way for convenience. Like, can I change my story from determination and discipline to one of convenience? Because the world now has all sorts of hacks for things that can be done for us, specifically by AI, right? AI is promising. I don't know if you see this on your social media feeds. It's all over my social media feeds. It's like, hey, if you do take 5 minutes a day to learn AI, it will plan and organize and structure and execute your entire life for you. You don't have to do anything. ChatGPT has these commercials that are playing on TV now. One of them is a young guy wanting to plan a trip when his sister is home for the holidays, so he goes to ChatGPT and he says, hey, ChatGPT, plan a trip for me and my sister. They're sitting in this car, and then all of a sudden, up pops this itinerary for a 4-day trip with his sister, and they just drive away. In a matter of seconds, this itinerary is done for you. So sometimes we follow the story of determination and discipline. Sometimes we hope that the story of convenience will do it for us. Last year, around this time, we launched a series, not just a sermon series, but an initiative for our church called Storytellers, which comes from Psalm 107, verse 2. Let the redeemed of the Lord tell their story. And we are doubling down on this series. We are doubling down on this initiative because we believe that the best way to understand your life and your faith journey is through the lens of storytelling, and the story that you are living. And if you've journeyed with us over the course of this last year, we've had multiple stretches. We did it in Advent, where we have people come up and tell stories of what God is doing in their life and how God is writing their story continually. Because with this initiative, there's a few assumptions that we hold. The first assumption is God is always present, and he's always at work in your life. God is always inviting you to continue to develop your story and his story in your life on a daily basis. The question is, are we aware of it, and are we engaging with it? That's one assumption. The second assumption is that your story matters. That you have a story to tell. Psalm 107, verse 2, let the redeemed of the Lord tell their story. If God is at work in your life, if God is doing new things, if he is continually bringing redemption into your life, you have a story to tell. Your story matters. And then third, your story finds its fulfillment in God's story. Your story finds its fulfillment in God's story. When we come to this place where we want things to change in our life, the driving motivation is often we want to experience satisfaction, fulfillment, and joy. And usually when we want to make it change, it's because there's a lack of satisfaction, fulfillment, and joy. And our belief is God desires for you to find satisfaction, fulfillment, and joy. Sometimes we think that God wants to stop those things in our life, but the opposite is true. God wants to bring those things to the fullest in your life. That's what Jesus says in John 15, right before he goes to the cross. The last thing he says to his disciples is, I've told you all these things so that my joy would be in you and your joy would be complete. In John 10, he says, I've not come to, or the enemy has come to steal, kill, and destroy, but I have come to bring life and bring it to the fullest. Like Jesus wants us to experience satisfaction, fulfillment, and joy. And our belief and our assumption is that your joy finds its fulfillment in God's story. Which then raises the question, though, like kind of raises the assumption, like if that's true, that your ultimate satisfaction, fulfillment, and joy is found in God's story, it means you have to know God's story. And that can seem really intimidating because the Bible is a really big book written thousands and thousands of years ago with all of these people and places and rituals and customs that seem very disconnected from our everyday life. And it can be hard to enter into that, but we believe that that story is where you find your greatest satisfaction, fulfillment, and joy. That's why, as we said in the announcement video, we're launching a 13-week Bible reading plan called God's Big Story to give you a big picture view of what the Scriptures are all about, to hopefully give you some handles so that you can access what's going on in the Scriptures. And so if you have questions about that, if you're like, hey, I want to follow along with that, how do I access that? Talk to Jake, talk to Monty. They'll be in the lobby in between services. They'd love to connect you with that reading plan that will start next Sunday. Because again, we believe that the Scriptures are the greatest story ever told. And what I want to do with our time remaining is I want to give you like a 30,000-foot view of what the Bible is all about and how you can find your greatest satisfaction, fulfillment, and joy in the story that the Scriptures are telling. Now, when it comes to understanding the storyline of the Bible, there are two primary ways that you can think that through. One is you can think of it as a 4-act play that goes like this: creation, which happens in Genesis 1 and 2, the fall, the destruction of our world because sin enters into our world, Genesis 3 through 11, and then this amazing long story of redemption that goes from Genesis 12 all the way to Revelation 20. And then you have restoration, Revelation 21 and 22, God restoring the world to the way He designed it to be all the way back at the beginning. If you traveled with us last year through this Storytellers series, we talked about that way of viewing the Bible in one of the sermons in that series. It's a very valid way, a very compelling way to think about the story of the Scriptures. Another way to think about the storyline of the Bible is in 5 parts. One, you have creation, again, happening in Genesis 1 and 2. You have the fall happening in Genesis 3 through 11. And then you have the story of Israel, how God creates a unique people for Himself, which then leads us to the story of Jesus, which we have in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then you have the story of the church, starting in Acts, all the way to the end of the New Testament. And what I want to do today is I want to highlight this way of understanding the story of the Scriptures, specifically focusing on the story of Israel in Jesus' connection to Israel and what he is ultimately doing with their story. Are you ready for that? I don't know if you are. We are going to cover a lot of ground. If you're a note taker, get your pencil sharp. We are going to go from beginning to end in about 15 minutes, so buckle up. Because the story of Israel, we think of Israel as a nation. The story of Israel actually starts with an individual. There's a guy named Abraham in the book of Genesis. And God calls Abraham, and he says, I'm going to create a whole new group of people. Everything that's happened from Genesis 3 all the way to Genesis 11 has been a big pile of destruction. And he says, hey, I'm starting to create a new people, and Abraham, I'm starting with you. Now, Abraham is 75 years old when God puts that call in his life, which means for you, if you are in that season of life, God is not done with you. Even at 75 years old, God has a plan and a purpose for your life. Don't check out. Ask the Lord, hey, what would you have for me? Now, what God had for Abraham at 75 years old was a kid. I don't know if God has a kid for you at 75 years old. It actually took Abraham another 25 years before he had that kid. He was 100 when he had that kid. His son's name was Isaac. And then Isaac had two sons, Jacob and Esau. Now, there was all sorts of sibling rivalry and brotherly tension between these two boys, so much so that Jacob was thought to be a swindler and a deceiver, and he actually deceives Esau out of his birthright because Esau was the firstborn. Because of that, Jacob thought Esau was going to kill him, and so he takes off and he runs away. On his runaway adventure, he has this crazy encounter with God where he actually wrestles with God. And during that encounter, God changes Jacob's name to Israel. So Israel initially starts not as a nation, but as an individual, as a person. Then over the course of time, Israel has 12 sons that will later become the nation of Israel, that will later become the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, what you find at the end of Genesis, right? Because all of this is taking place in the book of Genesis. And what happens at the end of Genesis is that there's this famine that sweeps the land. And so Israel and his 12 sons, they go to Egypt to survive because there is food in Egypt. Now, when we think of Israel's story, the most simple way to think about it is in three parts. Those three parts, one, start with Egypt. When you open up the book of Exodus, Israel and his family are living in Egypt. And over time, their family grows and gets bigger and gets bigger and gets bigger as more and more kids come around. And this makes Pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt, nervous. He thinks to himself, if this group of people gets too big, they can overtake us and rule our nation. So his solution is to put them in captivity. If I make them slaves and control them, then I don't have to worry about them overtaking us. And he gives them one simple job: make bricks to build my empire. And that's what Israel does for hundreds of years. And over that time, they are crying out to the Lord for help. Save us, rescue us, redeem us. And the Lord hears their cry. And the book of Exodus tells us the story of a man named Moses, who God sends to have a showdown with Pharaoh, to show that he, not Pharaoh, is the true God and the one who is ruling and reigning over all things. And through 10 different plagues, God rescues and redeems Israel from the grip of Pharaoh in Egypt and ultimately brings them to freedom. That's the first part of their story. They find themselves in captivity in Egypt, and God rescues them. The second part of their story is God redeems them and has this dramatic exit, which we would call the Exodus, and takes them out into the desert, right? They cross the Red Sea, the waters part, Pharaoh releases them, he changes his mind, he goes and he chases after them. They get to the edge of the Red Sea, and this miracle happens. They walk across on dry land, and then when Pharaoh's army goes to chase after them, the waters rush back over and drown them all. They get to safety in the desert, and God seeks to give them a new identity. He redefines who they are. No longer are they captives in Pharaoh's grip, but they are now the people of God. They are now, it says in Exodus 19, God's treasured possession. God loves them, cherishes them. And he says, I'm going to establish you as a nation. He redefines their understanding of who they are, and he says, I'm now going to establish you as a nation. And in order to be a nation, what they need is land. And so God is saying, hey, I'm taking you to this amazing promised land that flows with milk and honey, where you will settle and develop there. So they go through this long wandering journey through the desert. They get to the promised land. God says, send 12 spies to go scout out the land. And these 12 spies come back and they say, this land is amazing. It is the best land we've ever seen, but there's one problem. There's giants who live in the land. And there's no way that we can overtake these giants. And God says to them, no, trust me. I will move them out. This land is yours for the taking. And they say, God, we don't believe you. We should pack up and go back to Egypt. It would be safer for us to live there than go fight against these giants. And they distrust what God tells them. They distrust that God can do what he says he's going to do. And he says, therefore, your consequence is that you will wander in the desert for 40 years. Until one whole generation has passed. Then you will enter into the promised land. The second chapter of their story is this wandering for 40 years. A generation passes, and then eventually they do find themselves in the promised land. Now, when they get into the promised land, and we would say the third part of their story is eventually exile. Because when they get into the promised land, they're called to be ruled by judges and prophets. But after a little while living in the promised land, the Israelites notice that all of the other nations around them have kings. And they come to a guy named Samuel, who's one of the judges and prophets at that time. And they say to Samuel, hey, Samuel, we want a king to rule our nation. And Samuel says, no. You don't understand. God is your king, and he is ruling us as a people. Like, no. We want a human king. We want a human king. And he says, why? Why do you want a human king? He says, they say, because we want to be like every other nation around us. And Samuel says, fine, if that's what you want, fine. But this king is going to destroy you. He's not going to lead you into life. And that's exactly what happens. Not only do they want to be like every other nation in their leadership, they want to be like every other nation in their worship. And they start to worship all of these false gods. They repeatedly slip into the practice of idolatry. And God regularly sends prophets, like we have this whole section of the Bible called the prophets, people who are sent by God to the nation of Israel to say, stop worshiping other gods. Turn back to your God. He's the one who's provided for you. He's the one who's been faithful to you. He's the one who's done all of this for you. But instead of listening to these prophets, they repeatedly ignore the prophets. And basically the message of the prophets is, if you keep going in this direction, it will lead to your destruction. If you really want to be like every other nation, I'm actually going to send them to you, and they will haul you off into exile, and you will be captives once again. And that's exactly what happens. They slip into idolatry repeatedly. God sends prophets to warn them. They ignore the prophets. These nations come along and haul them off into exile. And what you see through Israel's story is this cycle that just turns over time and time again. God redeems his people. Multiple times you can read through the Old Testament of how God brings redemption to his people. And then after he brings redemption to his people, there's some measure of distrust that they have. Like, he's not going to come through in the way that he says. He's not going to provide what he says he's going to provide. He's not going to protect the way that he says he's going to protect. And they ignore God's guidance, which ultimately leads them into trouble. And then God, because he's gracious, because he's compassionate, because he's slow to anger and abounding in love, he redeems his people again. But then they distrust, they mistrust. He's not going to do what he says he's going to do. He's not going to be faithful to his own promises. So we're going to go do our own thing. And they ignore God's guidance, and it leads them into trouble. So what you find when you read Israel's story is this cycle. But the other thing you find, if you're honest with yourself, as you read Israel's story, is that you come to see is that their story actually is our story. If we're honest with ourselves, their story is our story, because we too are people who have received the call and the path to redemption from the Lord. But there are plenty of times when we mistrust or distrust God, and we ignore God's guidance. We go do our own thing, and it finds us in a place of trouble. And maybe you're in one of those places right now. Maybe as you look back on 2025, you would say 2025 was characterized by trouble that I found myself in because I didn't trust what God was saying, and I ignored God's guidance and his wisdom, and I did my own thing. Years ago, pastoring another church, I was sitting in my office one day, and the woman who was kind of like our front desk administrator, she had a window by the front door. In her office, there was this window by the front door, and this like big, burly guy walked past her window, walked right into the church, and she caught his, movement past the window, and he walked right into the church, came right into the sanctuary, knelt down at the foot of the stage and just started to weep. She didn't come up to him, but she stood at the back of the door, and she kind of looked in, and she saw him weeping, and she came to my office, and she's like, "Hey, Brian, there's this guy that I don't recognize who is bawling his eyes out in the worship center. You might want to go check on him." So I leave my office, I come into the sanctuary. Right away from the back of the room to the front of the room, I can tell I don't know this guy. He's never been to our church before. I walk up to him, and I just kind of sat next to him on the stage and just kind of was there for a minute. Took him a while. He didn't look up, but he is like heaving and sobbing. Eventually, I just kind of started to rub his back, like, maybe that's okay. I don't know how he feels about personal touch, but maybe I should do this. And eventually, he kind of looked up. He sat up. Again, he'd never been to our church before. I think he was just driving by, and he was so overcome with guilt. And he started to tell me about all of these relationships that he had had with people who weren't his wife. And he just kind of detailed all of this for me. And one of the things he said was, "I know I shouldn't, but I do it anyway." And I don't know what ever happened to him. He never came back. I never saw him again. He never came back and collapsed at the front of the stage. But as a pastor, that's one of those phrases you hear regularly. I know I shouldn't, but I do it anyway. I know God has better things for me, but I do this thing over here anyway. I know that I shouldn't go search up that thing online, but I find myself doing it repeatedly, and I do it anyway. I know that I shouldn't pursue that relationship with that person over there because I am married, but I find myself doing it anyway. I know that I should try and control my anger and not have these explosive fits of rage, but it feels so good when I do it, and I do it anyway. I know that I shouldn't worry and be overcome with anxiety about how God will provide, but I do it anyway because I actually don't trust that God is going to do anything. I know I shouldn't be controlled by money, but every time I think about giving something to somebody in need, it just makes me cringe because I think, this is my safety and my security. I know I should be generous, but I just hold on to everything that I have anyway. If we're honest with ourselves, as we read the Old Testament, the Israelite story is our story. Now, if you paid attention to the announcement video, we said we were going to be in Matthew 1 through 5. We have now finally arrived at Matthew 1 through 5. And we're not going to go through all of it. I'm just going to highlight a handful of verses. Because the question is, what does Jesus have to do with Israel's story if they find themselves in this cycle of redemption, distrust, ignoring God's guidance, and then ultimately in a place of trouble? Well, if you have been around church over the last month, one of the things we've been talking about is Jesus' birth. That's what we talk about in December. Jesus was born of a virgin named Mary, born to a man named Joseph. And Mary is told by the angel Gabriel, you're going to have God's child. Mary has to go and tell Joseph, hey, I'm actually pregnant with the Lord's baby. Joseph initially doesn't believe her. But then in a dream, an angel comes to Joseph to tell him, hey, Mary is not lying. And then after that dream, Joseph changes his mind. He was going to divorce Mary, but then he changes his mind to continue in his relationship with her. And this is what we read in Matthew 1, verse 22 and 23 in response to that dream. All of this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. Notice the one highlighted word there, fulfill. Make note of that. Because after Jesus is eventually born to Mary and Joseph, there's another king in Israel at that time. His name is Herod. Not a true Israelite, but a client king placed by Rome to keep track and control the Jews living in Israel. He was known to be king of the Jews. There's an announcement that is made to him that this baby named Jesus is actually going to be a new king. And Herod gets nervous because anytime a new king comes in to a region, it's a threat to the current king. And so he decides, I'm going to go out and kill every baby 2 years and younger to make sure I wipe out this king. And then another dream happens for Joseph. And Joseph is told to do this in a dream. This is Matthew chapter 2, verse 13 through 15. An angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. Get up, he said, take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him. So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night and left for Egypt, where they stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, out of Egypt I will call my son. Now, where have we seen Egypt before? Who went to Egypt to survive? The Israelites. They were only an extended family at that time, but they went to Egypt for safety. And eventually they are called out of Egypt. Now, Herod dies. Joseph is told to take his family back to Israel, back to the region of Galilee in northern Israel. We're not told a whole lot of Jesus' childhood, but one of the first things that happens before he steps on the stage of his public ministry is he goes to the Jordan River to be baptized. Now, this is Matthew 3, 13 through 15. Jesus came from Galilee to the Jordan River to be baptized by John the Baptist, who is preparing the way for the Messiah to come to Israel. But John tried to deter him, saying, I need to be baptized by you, and do you come to me? Jesus replied, let it be so now. It is proper for us to do this to fulfill all righteousness. Then John consented. So what you have is you have Jesus. This is all within the first few chapters of Matthew. Jesus is born. He goes to Egypt. He's called out of Egypt. And then the very next thing that happens is he goes into a body of water, which might remind us of the Israelites crossing the Red Sea. Right after Jesus is baptized in this body of water, he goes to the wilderness. All of chapter 4 of Matthew is Jesus wandering in the wilderness for 40 days. Which should remind us of the Israelites wandering in the wilderness for 40 years, where they are continually tempted to trust God and they repeatedly fail. Jesus goes into the wilderness for 40 days, where he's repeatedly tempted and he does trust God. He comes out of the wilderness And the very next thing that happens in Matthew 5 is he calls disciples, he goes to the top of a mountain, and he begins to preach specifically about the Old Testament law. And what he says about the Old Testament law, this is Matthew 5, verse 17, "Do not think I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." See, what Jesus is doing in the beginning of Matthew's gospel is he's retracing the steps of Israel's story. He's retracing the steps. They went to Egypt, he went to Egypt. They got called out of Egypt, he got called out of Egypt. They went through the Red Sea, he crosses through the Jordan River in his baptism. They go out into the wilderness for 40 years, he goes into the wilderness for 40 days. Moses goes up on the top of the mountain to receive the law from God and give it to the people. Jesus goes up onto a mountain and reframes the law around himself. Jesus retraces the Israelites' steps and retraces their story, fulfilling it every step of the way. Essentially, you could say it this way: Jesus is and does for Israel what Israel couldn't be or do for themselves. Jesus is and does for Israel what Israel couldn't be and do for themselves. They were called to be God's special possession. They were called to follow him closely so that they could bear witness to the world of who God is and the love that he has for them. And they couldn't do it because they were so consumed with trusting in themselves. And what we said earlier was that Israel's story is our story. And if Jesus is and does for Israel what they couldn't be and do for themselves, it means Jesus is and does for us what we couldn't be and do for ourselves. Jesus is and does for us, because we have the same call to live a righteous life, to go out into the world and demonstrate who God is through our actions. And oftentimes, we find ourselves in that cycle of distrusting God, ignoring God's guidance, and finding ourselves in trouble. But because God is gracious, compassionate, slow to anger, and abounding in love, he regularly pursues us and gives us another chance. Essentially, you could say it this way: what Jesus is doing for Israel and for us is Jesus is the fulfillment of our story. Jesus is the fulfillment of Israel's story, and Jesus is the fulfillment of your story, which means Jesus is the thing you're seeking, even if you don't realize it. Jesus is the thing you're desiring, because we all desire satisfaction, fulfillment, and joy, and Jesus offers it in spades, more than anything in this world will. There's a guy named Nabil Qureshi. This is a picture of him. And he was a Muslim, grew up in a Muslim household, and had a pretty dramatic conversion to Christianity while he was in college. He wrote a book about it called Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus, where he has a conversation with a friend named David pretty much all throughout his college years, where they talk about religion and faith. David is a strong Christian. Nabil grew up as a Muslim. And what you see during this book is that there's this pursuit of God, but through the help of his friend David and all these conversations he has along the way, he comes to realize, and he desires God in his life. He's a devout Muslim who wants to do what's right, but he learns through the course of this journey that Jesus is the one who is the ultimate revelation of God. I've been reading this book over the last month. I'm like 2/3 of the way through, and it's fascinating as he tells the story of this kind of reframing of faith, God, and life, and what it means to be devoted to God, specifically in and through the person of Jesus. He's starting to describe how he wants God in his life, and it ultimately finds its fulfillment in the person of Jesus. And what I wonder for you is, like, what are you seeking in life? Like, maybe you're seeking after God and you just don't know exactly what that looks like. Or maybe you're seeking something else. Maybe you're hoping something else in 2026 will bring satisfaction, fulfillment, and joy. And what Jesus demonstrates to us through Israel's story is that he is the one who offers you the fulfillment that you're looking for. And even though we're going to all of these other things in the world that might actually be giving us trouble or maybe are giving us glimpses of satisfaction, Jesus is continually coming to us saying, no, I'm the one you long for. Come to me, and your fulfillment and your joy will exponentially increase. And what we find in the story of Jesus is not only does he bring fulfillment by way of going to Egypt and going into the wilderness and doing all of these things, he also retraces Israel's story through being their sacrificial lamb. Through being the lamb that is crucified on the cross with his blood painted on the cross for the sake of his people. Even though we find ourselves in that cycle, God's coming to us repeatedly saying, I've died for you. I've given my life for you. The fulfillment of what you long is found in me. So come to the table and feast on me, because I'm the one who will satisfy what you want.